Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. I'm not much of a hater. While everyone else is outside drinking haterade, I'm inside drinking love juice. No, I don't like that. Whatever. Point is, while I know some people do sort of get enjoyment at disliking things, like a sort of chemical rush in the brain, I just really don't. Now, that doesn't mean I love every JRPG I play, far from it. But I'm more likely to ignore the noisy crowd and try to find something to love in a game if at all possible. With that in mind, I wanted to talk about some games that are unfairly viewed, in my opinion. These are all games that I have a lot of affection for, and none of them are nostalgic. Like, these are all games I've played since the doctor started giving me advice about maybe cutting back on the sodium so I don't die or whatever. If you agree with my love for any of these games, let me know. I'm sure there are dozens of us out there. And if you disagree, well, you're already typing your comments, so, go ahead. Now, before we dive in, could you do me a favor and crush that like button as if it just insulted your most beloved relative? That like button has it coming. And if you're not subscribed, could you help me get to 10K by hitting that subscribe button? You don't have to crush it. You can just tenderly tap it. But it really helps me out so much, and I appreciate it more than you can know. All right, that's out of the way. Let's talk about some hated games, why don't we? If you've seen much of my channel, you probably know how much I adore Harvestella. If you're completely unfamiliar, here's the basics. You awake in a world that's suffering from an event called quietus. This is a period that happens in between seasons, and it causes illness to anyone who steps outside during it. Except you, of course. You start a farm to provide for yourself and go on a quest to figure out what's going wrong with the world by investigating the Sea Slate, these giant crystals that are responsible for controlling the world's seasons. Combat is full-on action RPG, but there's a decent amount of complexity with its job system that lets you take on a variety of roles. And it has a soundtrack by Go Shiina, one of the best video game composers in history. Harvestella is one of my all-time favorite games, and I've tried my best to convince as many people as possible to give it a try. But with a Metacritic score of 73, it's not the easiest sell. Sure, there are plenty of worse scoring games out there, but when there's just so many excellently reviewed games to play, talking someone into investing 80 hours in a game that's saddled with the very definition of middling reviews, well, it's tough. Regardless, there's so much about this game to love. Game Informer, RIP to a real one by the way, but Game Informer said it has a sluggish pace and that it's, and I'm quoting, one of the biggest chores I've played in some time. This hurts my soul. It's truly astonishing how the same experience can resonate so differently for different people. I honestly found no part of Harvestella to be a chore, even the literal chores you have to do on your farm. The moment-to-moment gameplay is so varied and the farm simulator elements are so minor that I don't recall ever feeling the least bit bored. And even if I hated the farming elements, which I don't, I still don't think it would lower my love of this game by much. The story, the characters, the art, the music, everything just comes together so beautifully here. This is the tragedy of the AA game. There is so much love and creativity poured into games like this, and they so often go overlooked because the masses are drawn toward the flashiest games. In other media, that's not always terrible. An indie film might not have a huge audience, but it also likely didn't cost multiple millions of dollars to make. Even a video game of Harvestella's scale and scope requires a significantly bigger audience to break even, let alone to become something Square Enix would consider worth investing in further. I hope we haven't seen the last of Harvestella, or at least not the last of games made by this extremely talented team. The JRPG landscape is better for having these sorts of games in it. Tales of Legendia is sort of the black sheep of the Tales of series. For one, it's the only game in the mainline series not made by the usual Tales of team. For another, it's stubbornly stuck to 2D combat while the rest of the mainline series was going all in on 3D. But even if Legendia will never be many people's favorite, there's a lot to appreciate here. Tales of Legendia is the story of Senel and Shirley, who find themselves shipwrecked on the Legacy, which is technically a ship, but it's a ship the size of a continent that has all the scenery and wildlife you'd expect from a landmass, except it can move around. It's a bit odd. But Shirley is quickly kidnapped by some people who believe she's some sort of mythical chosen one who's going to lead the people to prosperity. Like I mentioned, combat happens on a 2D plane, though the characters and enemies are all 3D models. This puts it squarely within the classic Tales of franchise formula, which at the time many were starting to tire of. Look, I'm not going to go as far out on a limb for Tales of Legendia as I will for Harvestella. There are some significant issues with Legendia that keep it from masterpiece status. The pacing, for one. At the halfway point of the game, you reach what feels like, for all intents and purposes, the climax of the story, and then it continues. It's not ideal. The graphics are a bit on the muddy side, and it can be punishingly difficult, but Legendia does some things so incredibly well that you can't simply write it off like Gaming Age did, calling it, quote, a pretty disappointing addition to a series of RPGs that's managed to grow stale in the past few years. You can't even go as far as the New York Times, which claimed it, quote, forces you to do mildly entertaining things over and over until all the entertainment has been squeezed out. Also, hang on, the New York Times? The freaking New York Times was reviewing Tales of Legendia? Does that seem crazy down banana pants to anyone else? Anyway, Tales of Legendia, first of all, has a brilliant score by Go Shiina. Now, I promise this is the last mention of Go Shiina in this video, but the man is a genius and more people need to hear about his work. Aside from that, Tales of Legendia has some of the most interesting, nuanced, and entertaining characters I've ever seen in a JRPG. In particular, I want to highlight Shirley. She starts out the game as the standard damsel in distress, but as the story progresses, you begin to see that she is so much more than that. She's complex, layered, and she's surprisingly aggressive for someone who's coded so demure and mindful. Even her AI in battle is striking. She's not particularly strong, but her default AI settings match her character in that she will rush into battle head on, even if she's not the best equipped to handle it. Despite its pacing issues, I will always think fondly about Tales of Legendia. It's the first game in the Tales of series where I really felt connected to the characters. Even if it's not a masterpiece, it's an incredibly interesting study in how to do characters right in a JRPG, and I think it deserves more credit for that. When I first saw trailers for Eternights, I thought, dang, this looks really cool, and I wondered who was behind it. It wasn't a company I'd ever heard of. Turns out that's because it's a new company, and that company is essentially one person. If the idea that Stardew Valley had been developed by a single person blew my mind, then this sent my mind into another dimension, TV edit of Dragon Ball Z style.
The noble act caused Piccolo to phase into another dimension.
I knew it took inspiration from Persona, that much was obvious even from the interface, and Persona is a great series to be inspired by, so I was ready for this game. Then I sat down to review it, and, well, let's just say I almost gave up on it. Eternights is the story of a world that's been overrun by what are essentially zombies. You and a small group of survivors are fighting your way through the city in the hopes of not just surviving, but getting to the bottom of exactly what happened. Naturally, with a bunch of horn dog young people all crammed together in a tight space, romance is in the air, so there's a whole dating sim system wrapped up in everything too. Combat is action-based, and this is where I ran into trouble at first. See, it's really hard to put my finger on, but there's something different about the combat in Eternights. If the vast majority of action RPGs share a sort of similar rhythm, then Eternights is fully on the offbeats. Playing this game like I've played countless other action RPGs left me frustrated and ready to give up in the first area. But I was committed to reviewing it, so I forced myself to stay with it. And somehow, suddenly, it just clicked. And not just clicked, but like I found myself loving the rhythm of the combat. It didn't get easy per se, but I began to identify when I was making mistakes and I couldn't blame the game for them anymore. Of course, the combat isn't the only thing that was criticized about this game. RP Gamer said, quote, Eternights is all dressed up with nowhere to go, and that it's, quote, lacking that touch of finesse or technical flourish that oozes from the few series that serves as inspiration. Respectfully, I honestly couldn't disagree with that more. Particularly when considering its development was handled by primarily one person, I think there's loads of style and finesse on offer here. Style and finesse to spare, even. Others criticize the enormous amount of systems crammed into a relatively short runtime, which, I mean, sure. There's a lot going on here that would have benefited from a game that ran for longer than 12 hours. But honestly, I found it refreshing to experience a game that was A, short, and B, still had a variety of things to do. Not that I never grew tired of some elements. The memory game you have to play when scrounging for supplies is cool the first 4 or 5 times, but after that it starts to get a little stale. But the game's short enough that you're not forced to spend hours and hours in the elements that might not work for you. I found Eternights to be a fairly brilliant first attempt from a solo dev, and if this is what they're cranking out as their first effort, I can't wait to see where they go next. Crystar might be an acquired taste for some. The further down this list we go, the more true that's going to be, honestly. It's like a brilliant book full of fantastic characters and a plot that keeps you on the edge of your seat. But to get to it, you gotta solve a series of bland, cryptic puzzles on the cover to even get the thing open. That's a bad analogy, but I'm not gonna apologize for it, and I'm definitely not gonna think of a better one. Crystar is the story of Rey, a teenage girl who finds herself pulled into purgatory along with her younger sister. While there, she inadvertently causes her sister's untimely demise, and now Rey is forced to form a contract with some demons in order to get her back. The setup is weird. I mean, deeply weird. The visual novel storytelling is not going to work for everyone. The combat is all action-based, and it's not fantastic. Controls are a bit stiff, and enemies are palette swap varieties of the same 6 creatures over and over. So good God, why am I talking about this game? It sure sounds like it deserves the hate. Well, I disagree. Like I alluded to, the story and the characters are brilliant. At first glance, this seems like it's going to be your run-of-the-mill anime-style story, and here I'm using anime a bit derisively, because even though I'm a weeb, I can recognize elements of the thing I love that are, let's say, less than grand. But it evolves in such a way that I legitimately didn't know what was coming, and the twists all felt real and earned. Unlike RPG Fan, which said its story, quote, thinks it's much more interesting and important than it actually is, I found the plot incredibly moving and engaging. And on top of that, the music is beautiful, and the highlight for me is the English voiceover. The actors all did a phenomenal job bringing these characters to life. Yes, once again, I'm encouraging you to try a game that I describe as having less than stellar gameplay because of its aesthetic elements. But much like my poor analogizing skills, I won't apologize for it. I want to normalize playing games for reasons beyond just the simple fun factor of the moment-to-moment gameplay. Just like there are a multitude of reasons why you might like a particular book or movie or TV show, there can be innumerable reasons why you might like a video game. There's no shame at all in enjoying a game that isn't the most fun, because fun isn't the only thing I'm interested in experiencing, and I have a feeling the same could be said for you. Hardcore Gamer described the longest 5 minutes as having, quote, a near offensively easy combat system, brief dungeons, and a lacking overworld to trudge through. And while it concedes that the game is, quote, competently made, it doesn't think it's worth your time. Obviously, I'm here to disagree, per the title of this video. So the longest 5 minutes is a classic-looking 8-bit JRPG built around the premise of a hero losing his memories and needing to regain them in time to defeat the final boss. Yeah, the game starts at the final boss encounter, at which point the main character is hit with a spell that leaves him with amnesia. The game cuts back and forth between this final encounter and the hero's journey as they make their way from their hometown to the castle of the Demon King. Battles remind me most of the original Lufia, with barely animated characters and enemies trading blows in what is admittedly a very easy and very basic combat system. As seems to be a trend with this list, the music is absolutely gorgeous, and surprisingly, the story's excellent too. So why is this game sitting at a 67 on Metacritic? Well, I get the sense that it's because people tend to compare video games to the best in the genre, and don't often take the time to appreciate a game for the unique thing it does. To me, it's like saying stopping by woods on a snowy evening isn't very good, because it's not like War and Peace. But that comparison is weak because one is an epic novel, and one is a poem. Some games are poems, and to me, that's a beautiful thing. Video games are so young. They're young enough that a sizable number of you watching this were alive when the medium was created. We actually get to watch an entirely new form of storytelling, of art, grow up before our eyes. How many times has that happened throughout history? Very few, I can tell you that. And video games are evolving so quickly that it can be hard to keep up. Looking at the video games of the 80s, even the JRPGs, it would be difficult to think of describing any of them as poetry. But look at how far we've come. Now there are video games that can fill so many different roles, games that aren't just out there trying to be the flashiest or best, whatever best even means. If you're interested in a game that distills the essence of a JRPG down into its most basic parts, while still conveying a moving story and in its own way commentating on the genre itself, then The Longest 5 Minutes is worth a look. Blue Reflection might weird some people out. This is a game that has extremely detailed wet shirt physics for its underage female characters, and that's just a very strange thing to invest money and development time into. Okay, I know some people will be mad at me for saying that, but it's whatever, like what you like, you know? But it's just stuff like that makes me feel like a creep. But look, I'm not here to talk about the things I don't like about Blue Reflection. I'll let Metacritic do that. Push Square said all of Blue Reflection's good ideas are, quote, left to fester in a pool of mediocrity and drowned in an adventure that feels boring and stale before it's even really begun. RP Gamer says it feels, quote, cheaply made. RPG Fan thinks your time is, quote, best spent elsewhere. I'll get to why I disagree, but first, let's talk about what Blue Reflection is at its core. Blue Reflection is the story of a ballerina who can't dance anymore. An injury has basically left her unable to compete in the one thing she was hinging her entire life on, and now she has to start at a new high school as a bitter shell of a person. Naturally, she ends up being chosen as a reflector, essentially a magical girl who has to team up with others to take down the Sephiroth, these ancient, grotesque monsters that want to unalive everyone. Am I using that right? We don't say the K word anymore, we say unalive. Is that an algorithm thing? Anyway, I'm old. You spend your time split between your high school, where normal teenage drama happens, and a variety of social links a la Persona are available to you, and the common, which is the manifestation of the collective unconscious in the form of a handful of, to be frank, kind of boring dungeons. Battles are a bit stronger in that they're an interesting take on the Grandia formula, where you have the ability to delay enemy attacks with your own. Blue Reflection is a game that I can absolutely see people disliking, and I say that as a person who loves it. The gameplay can be somewhat repetitive, and that's an attention killer for a lot of people. But there are elements here that just kept me hooked from beginning to end. First and foremost, it's the vibes. This might be the first game I ever found myself describing based solely on its vibes. There is just something pure and nostalgic about walking down a high school hallway in the late afternoon with sunlight filtering in through windows that could probably stand a good cleaning. Even though the high school experience of the average Japanese girl is probably quite a bit different from my own high school experience, I still felt it, and that was an amazing thing to have a video game draw out of me. Helping the vibes along is the soundtrack, which is just every flavor of gorgeous. It's honestly like heartbreakingly beautiful, if I'm honest. And the story is so powerful, it's just truly stunning. You end up feeling the characters' pain and longing, and man, considering there's both a cultural and a language barrier between me and them, it's astonishing how much I was able to relate. It's a testament to the storytellers at Gust. I recommend giving this a try, seeing if it vibes with you like it did with me, and then you can dive into the sequel, which, not gonna lie, is even better. For some reason, I was surprised by the discourse surrounding Reynatis when it came out. I played it for review, and I found it to be very competent on the gameplay front, with a story that was doing something really meaningful and powerful. So I expected most people to have a similar take. Instead, I heard a lot of what almost sounded like rage. The Gamer said, quote, Reynatis is one of the most miserable experiences I have had with a game in decades. Push Square said everything outside of the story and world building felt, quote, half-baked and repetitive. Although IGN Italy called the storytelling lackluster, so I guess there isn't even agreement on which parts are okay. I started to feel like I was nuts, or that they had accidentally sent me a version of the game that was pretty good when they meant to send me something that was the worst game to curse a console with its presence since Drake of the 99 Dragons. To summarize the game, Reynatis is a story about modern-day wizards living in Shibuya. In this world, the government tightly controls wizards and has made it illegal for them to use their powers. It's all about the suppression of wizard kind by the majority who don't have powers, and it's a very interesting and timely story to tell. After the cascade of don't waste your time reviews, I had to sit down and really think about why I came away with such a different take. It's not that I don't see the flaws in Reynatis, it definitely has them. It's just that I don't expect a game to be flawless, and that so long as the flaw in question isn't something that I consider a deal breaker, I'm unlikely to put a game aside if the story and the aesthetics are working for me. Truth be told, it's not as if the combat in Reynatis expands into the biggest and most elaborate system that's ever been seen in an action RPG, but the game isn't so long that it really needs to. It's fun to play, and the flashy combat sequences do a good job of entertaining in between the sometimes heavy storyline sequences. It's not going to change your life. I mean, probably. I don't know your life. But that doesn't mean there isn't something to gain from it. Think of smaller games like this as palate cleansers between the giant games so many of us consume on a regular basis. It has a story to tell, and it tells that story. And I definitely enjoyed experiencing it. Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII is, canonically speaking, the point of the story that's furthest along on the timeline. At least, I'm pretty sure about that. It's post-Advent Children, it's post all the novels. If there's any Final Fantasy VII media with story that takes place post-Dirge, I'd love to know about it, so let me know in the comments. I only mention this because A, I wanted to, and B, I just love the story of the extended Final Fantasy VII universe so much. So much meaning I'm here to defend Dirge of Cerberus before the court of the internet. Does that mean I'm crazy? No, of course not. My collection of severed doll heads means that. Dirge of Cerberus is a third-person shooter, which already makes it a strange bedfellow for Final Fantasy VII. Remember, this was ages before Remake and Rebirth reimagined the game as an action RPG, so an action-based game in a Final Fantasy universe was not a super expected thing. When choosing a main character, they were smart enough to pick Vincent, the mysterious vampire-adjacent guy who broods so hard. The dude broods. If you dig into Final Fantasy VII, you uncover bits of his history, how he was with the Turks at one point, and his love for Lucretia, Sephiroth's mother. Dirge of Cerberus pits him against Deep Ground, a group of genetically modified soldiers that are different than the group of genetically modified soldiers we know from the original game. Like any giant corporation, Shinra had different divisions unknowingly working on practically identical projects and wasting enormous amounts of time and money. Yeah, these C-level decision makers at these companies definitely deserve to make $14 quintillion a year. Terrible management. It's terrible. But I digress. The game was not a hit. GameSpot said the following. Quote, Dirge of Cerberus tells the interesting story of a memorable video game character, but beyond that, it's nothing more than a very generic shooter. A lot of reviews at the time said very similar things. Folks, I'm here to tell you, I agree. Yes, this is one game where I'm willing to concede that, in fact, it's not super fun. However, the part that's important to me, and the part that should be important to you if you're a big Final Fantasy VII fan, is the story. This is a direct continuation of the story of Final Fantasy VII after Advent Children. Not to mention, in the Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade chapter starring Yuffie, we're introduced to Deep Ground via one of the main antagonists of Dirge of Cerberus, which suggests to me that the developers of the Remake trilogy are taking the events of Dirge seriously. If you're a Final Fantasy VII stan, Dirge of Cerberus is required playing. If you don't like Final Fantasy VII, then, well, I guess you're free to play something else. If I had to drop an honorable mention on this list, it would be Final Fantasy 15. Really, I could have gone with 15, 13, or 16, because any Final Fantasy that released after we all started having to pay taxes gets a ton of hate right away from the JRPG community. I think because they're not like we remember them when we were kids. But I chose 15 because it's my personal favorite. It's rated too highly to actually make the list. Critic scores average around 81, but I love just about everything about Final Fantasy 15. Yes, even the way the story's told. It's a super solid game, even without all the DLC and movies and anime tie-ins. Give it a few more years, and I'm confident 15 will get its own surge of popularity like most of the other maligned Final Fantasies have. Anyway, that's it. What do you think? Am I nuts? Am I on point? Let me know down in the comments. Share with me some games you think aren't deserving of the hate they get too. Once again, if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, I would really appreciate it. And please be sure to check out the JRPG Pursuit podcast. Link for that is down in the description. So, with all that, until next time, bye.